Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Destry Jarvis. I'm Vice President of World Heritage USA and ICOMOS USA. We're pleased that you're with us today. I think this is a very interesting and exciting topic. It arose essentially from our annual symposium, which was last fall in San Antonio. We had a delegation from our counterpart in Mexico, ICOMOS Mexico, join us for discussions about potentials for collaboration, cooperation across the border. As most of you probably know, we've had binational World Heritage Sites with US and Canada on the border since 1979. The Wrangell, St. Elias, Kluane, Alsek, Tachincini region, 24 million acres, was designated. And the Glacier National Park in Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada was designated in 1995. So we discussed some, I think, exciting opportunities for potentially as many in the future as 4 sites along the US-Mexican border for collaboration, cooperation as World Heritage nominations. The one that we're discussing today, we have some excellent speakers on the subject, is El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And it's, I would say, as we would say, low-hanging fruit for a nomination, because the Mexican government and Mexico ICOMOS was successful in having the portion of the El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro in Mexico designated as a World Heritage Site in 2010. Prior to that, interestingly, on the US side of the border in New Mexico, the US Congress and President designated the American portion, the US portion of the El Camino, as a National Historic Trail, a component of the National Trail System in 2000. The interesting thing about, under our system, National Historic Trails is, while the trail itself was at one point a continuous actual route, what's important under National Historic Trail designation is that the key sites along the trail are protected. There does not have to be a continuous route, highway or pedestrian or horseback even, as is the case with National Scenic Trails, the other major component of the National Trail System, like the Appalachian Trail or the Continental Divide Trail or Pacific Crest Trail. Those are continuous routes that can be mapped and followed. National Historic Trails are a string of pearls, so to speak, connecting specific significant sites, historically significant sites, along the route that was historically taken. And that is the case with El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And so what we're proposing, this was actually proposed once before with our friends in Mexico. When they were pursuing the World Heritage nomination, they suggested, and we attempted to have the American portion designated as well. But there was opposition, essentially from one of the federal agencies along the route, Bureau of Land Management, and so it didn't happen when the Mexican portion was inscribed on the World Heritage List. We think the times have changed, the time is right, both substantively as far as the historic properties along the route and politically, to pursue this designation. And so we have begun the extensive and complex negotiations and discussions about getting this done. The interesting and one of the major complicating factors is the number of ownerships of the important historic sites along the route. There are 3 federal agencies, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are at least 5 of the sites owned by the Catholic Diocese. There are 6 or 7 of the sites owned either by the state of New Mexico or community towns along the route. And at least 3 of them are involved extant indigenous tribes, pueblos, and more certainly cover traditional indigenous territory. So getting everybody together on the same page is a task ahead of us. So welcome all of you here today. I'm going to transfer the mic, so to speak, to Michael Romero Taylor, whom some of you no doubt know. Michael is retired National Park Service, was at one point in the 90s the State Historic Preservation Officer for New Mexico, and has been a professional in the historic preservation field for all of his adult career and profession. Michael, would you take it over from here?
Thank you very much, Destry, and thank you for that great context of what we're going to be learning about here. First of all, I want to extend our good thoughts to Dr. Francisco Lopez Morales, who is going to be co-presenting with me this morning. Dr. Lopez Morales is unfortunately ill right now, pretty ill, and he's in the hospital, but hopefully within the next couple of days, he'll be released. So our good thoughts are with Dr. Pancho, as we call him. I'd like to, what I'll be doing is sharing this screen, and we will be looking at, about 19 images of what I will be talking about over the next 20 to 25 minutes or so. The Royal Road to the Interior Lands, the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. This is a fabled road here in our part of the hemisphere, coming up from Mexico up into the United States. About a quarter of it is located in what is today the United States. 3/4 of it is located in Mexico. This is part of the Camino Real Intercontinental, a major global system of communication that existed from the 1600s up through the 1800s. I'm taking the slide from what Dr. Morales had prepared. The Camino Real de Tierra Adentro was initially known as, and still known as, down in Mexico, as El Camino de la Plata, Silver Route. And it was known as this because of the great silver mines, especially up in Zacatecas and a little further north near Chihuahua. In the 16th century, the route finally arrived, at the very end of the century, the route finally arrived in northern New Mexico. And what they found were not the riches that they had found down in southern New Mexico. The Spaniards did not find all the gold and silver that they anticipated, but instead they found a number, thousands and thousands of indigenous populations scattered throughout the Rio Grande Valley and out on the plains as well. And this physical manifestation of this last section is perhaps the longest of the entire Camino Real. And it's much more vernacular in nature. The sites and the architecture down around Zacatecas and Chihuahua, for example, is very grandiose, mainly because of all the riches that came in from the mines. But further up north, it's much more modest, much more vernacular in nature. So a little bit more background on the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. It ties Spain's colonial capital of Mexico City to its northern frontier in distant New Mexico. It's the longest and oldest Euro-American road in North America. The route spans 4 centuries and 1,600 miles. And it's significant for Native American use, for mining, as I just talked about, down in the central part of Mexico, the northern part of Mexico, mainly for its missionary endeavors. And then in the 19th century, it became much more of a commercial route. The image on the right, you can see the existing Interstate 25. This is looking south towards El Paso from the Jornada del Muerto, a stretch of the desert in south central New Mexico. And on the left, you can see the remnants, the actual route, the trail ruts of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The political border that today bisects the Camino was created in 1848 through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then again altered in 1854 through the Gadsden Purchase, which was ratified in the town of Mesilla, where I grew up, just about an hour north of the Mexican border. And an image of that town you can see on the right-hand side. Now, for over 40 years, we here in the United States have collaborated extensively with Mexico in sharing as much information as we can on how to best tell the stories of the Camino Real, how to best preserve and protect the actual resources associated with that route. And that's an example of that is a workshop we held in Laredo, Texas, a few years ago, where we brought in many professionals from INA and professionals from the National Park Service and the BLM and other entities here in the States to talk about common challenges in protecting this important route. As Destry indicated, the Mexican sections were inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2010 as a cultural route. And that dossier, that nomination package, is a really well put together package that can be found in the link that you see here on the screen. And so I really suggest that if you'd like to learn more about the Camino Real in Mexico, to access this really well done document. Before we get into the actual sites in New Mexico and West Texas, I'd like to just quickly review the cultural routes criteria under which the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro was listed as a World Heritage Site. In 2008 in Quebec, at a World Heritage Committee meeting, the ICOMOS Cultural Routes Charter was approved. And again, there's a link here that you can access. And if you're interested in reading the fine print of what constitutes a cultural route by the definition of ICOMOS. But very briefly, I will hit the highlights of what constitutes a cultural route in terms of World Heritage recognition. A route of communication that has its own dynamic and historic function to serve a specific purpose. Cultural routes embody the complexities of geographical distance, layering of history, and a diversity of cultural themes. And a cultural route refers to a set of values whose whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Cultural routes reflect interactive movements of people, as well as multidimensional, continuous, and reciprocal exchanges of goods, ideas, knowledge, and values between peoples, countries, regions, or continents over significant periods of time. And cultural routes must have promoted a cross-fertilization of cultures in space and time, as reflected in both tangible and the intangible heritage, something very important when we consider cultural routes. They represent a qualitative change in the concept of heritage conservation. And to date, 6 cultural routes have been inscribed on the World Heritage List. They include the Camino Santiago in Europe, the sacred routes of the Kii Peninsula in Japan, the Negev Incense Route in the Mideast, El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro in Mexico, Capacnyan in South America, various segments of the Silk Route in Asia, and this is an ongoing project to add more segments as more countries come on board, and the Parachi Isla Grande in Brazil. And I must underscore that several symposia have been convened by the ICOMOS Specialized Committee on Cultural Routes, otherwise known as CIIC, and the proceedings of a lot of these seminars symposia can be found on the website that you see here in the center on the bottom. Most recently, we've had symposia in Chihuahua, Mexico, here in Santa Fe, and last year in Italy. So here in the United States, the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro passes through approximately 20 miles of West Texas, just below El Paso, up through El Paso, and then about 380 miles or so up to just beyond Santa Fe, to a place called San Juan, also known today as Ohkay Owingeh, the indigenous name that was used historically. This 400-mile route, as Destry mentioned, was designated a National Historic Trail in the year 2000. And a website to the National Historic Trails system can be found in the link that you see on the screen. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see of the 21 nationally designated National Historic Trails, out of the Santa Fe office, this office administers 10 of those trails. And those 10 trails are depicted up on the upper right in that map. As you can see, there's a western trajectory of a lot of these trails, representing trails such as the Santa Fe Trail, or I'm sorry, the Oregon, California Pioneer Trail. What you can see on the bottom are two trails coming up from Mexico. The arrow points to El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, and also through Texas, there's another important trail called Camino Real de los Tejas. So what we did, we being the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, is we came up with a draft nomination in 2009. And this consisted of a number of US properties that were initially selected because of their authenticity and integrity of setting that lend themselves to preservation and perpetuity. And these properties, in addition to being buildings, structures, civic plazas, and archaeological sites and landmarks, they include many route swales, actually the footprint of the road that goes through a lot of open public federal lands, especially here in New Mexico. So what happened to our initiative? Well, what happened was a conflict, which usually makes things slow down. The image on the right shows a section of the Camino Real in New Mexico called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man. This is a pretty much a waterless stretch of 90-mile desert, south central New Mexico. And because it was so isolated, it was chosen to be the location for what we call the Spaceport America, an initiative by the state of New Mexico and by a private business concern led by Richard Branson to build this hangar, basically an airport where spaceships go up into suborbital space. Because of the concern that our initiatives at that time in 2009 would interfere with the construction of Spaceport America, the Bureau of Land Management decided to halt proceeding with its nomination. And so it's been on a shelf since 2009, and it brings us to where we are today, where we're trying to resurrect this idea of having sites added to the existing World Heritage List for the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro that Mexico was successful in obtaining in 2010. And to give you a few ideas on the type of sites that we're looking at, we're probably looking at about 12 sites to be added to the existing nomination in West Texas and in New Mexico. There's road segments and archaeological sites. As I mentioned, a lot of these road segments are out in open federal lands, and there's a number of places along the federal lands that a visitor can actually get out and walk the trail, which gives the visitor a real good sense of what travel was like during that time period. There's, of course, buildings and districts associated with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro that we're looking at adding to the existing nomination. And one of them is the Palace of the Governors that you see here on the lower left. This is located on the plaza in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it's the oldest continuously used public building in the United States. It was built in 1610. It was a seat of government through the Spanish and Mexican periods, as well as to some extent through the American. And then it became a museum, something that it continues to be today. This is a National Historic Landmark that, again, it anchors the northern sections of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The other images are of various churches and historic buildings and districts throughout New Mexico and West Texas. There's 2 or 3 properties in West Texas that we're looking at adding to the World Heritage nomination as well. Landmarks are very important. And these images show a few of those landmarks that are associated with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. They were used as pilot knobs of sorts, navigation landmarks, and many of these landmarks had camping places, parajes, associated with them. And as I mentioned a little earlier, the intangible values along the route are very important. In my mind, just as important as the tangible values. So we're looking at highlighting these as well in the nomination process. There are different intangible aspects such as the pilgrimages, the music, the religion, earth and architecture, food, and the management of water, which in itself is just a wonderful story that I wish we could get into more now. But you can find more about the water management if you search acequias in New Mexico. This next image really underscores the importance of Native American influence. And I show this not as a footnote to our endeavors, but as something very integral and important to what we're wanting to do with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The route profoundly influenced the existing Native American communities, as well as the Spanish communities that came up the route. But these Native American communities had used the corridor for millennia before the arrival of the Spanish. So the Spanish very much depended on the indigenous populations to help orient them to what they found here in New Mexico, to where the water was, where the good cultivation areas were, and things of this nature. So because of that recognition, this nomination that we're proposing is to include 5 archaeological properties that were vibrant Native communities at the time of the initial European contact, as well as 2 extant Pueblo communities, one of which is the Sleta Pueblo that you see an image of here on a postcard from the 1920s on your right. And these communities, the 2 Pueblos that we're looking at, back in 2009, they were very much in favor of the idea of being considered for World Heritage designation. So as many of you know, tribal governments change year to year. So the idea is that we would go back to these tribal governments and propose again that they be considered for inclusion into the World Heritage nomination. Our criteria for inclusion on World Heritage list, of course, any site that is being proposed needs to meet what is termed the Outstanding Universal Value, otherwise known as UOV. And if you would like, anybody would like to access the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, you can see the link right here on the screen. 2 of the criteria that we're considering, and these can change, of course, are criteria 2. The route exhibits an exchange of human values over a span of more than 300 years, including universally significant developments in architecture and planning. And criteria 6, which brings in the intangibles. The route is directly associated with events and traditions of outstanding universal value, including the encounter, propagation, and continuing development of cultures, religions, and belief systems of both the old world and the new. So what do we need to do for reviving this tentative list nomination initiative? It's proposed that the United States components be nominated to the existing World Heritage Site as an expansion to the cultural route that Mexico was successful in getting inscribed in 2010. And we've had discussions with our Mexican counterparts, and we feel this is the easiest way to approach including sites here in the United States to the listing. The Mexican government very much supports this binational nomination process, and in fact, in tangent with our initiatives, the Mexican government is proposing to add 6 more sites to the World Heritage in the state of Chihuahua. At the time this nomination was prepared in 2010, unfortunately, the state of Chihuahua was not prepared to add sites to be considered. So the idea is that the United States and Mexico would come in together on this initiative to expand the World Heritage nomination. Most U.S. properties to be considered are owned by the government and nonprofits, and this, I believe, will help facilitate a lot of issues associated with including properties on the World Heritage. Many of these sites already have their management plans, and they have, to a large extent, buy-in by the managers of the properties. And I put this last bullet, second to last bullet in, because I wanted to underscore the importance of other Camino Reales in the United States, including the Camino Real de las Californias. And we're working actually right now that I believe Gilbert might be talking about a little bit more about the idea of really working with the state of California and the 2 states in Mexico, Baja California and Baja California Sur, to get initiatives started for nominating this very important route in the Californias. And we're doing presentations such as this, where we're trying to create a public awareness of our intent. Next month, we're going to be having another seminar, another symposium down in Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, the sister city to El Paso, Texas. Juarez is located in the state of Chihuahua, and there's a good program already set up to further some of these discussions of World Heritage listing. The final image that I'm going to be showing is this image, and it highlights the importance of these intangibles such as the acequia, the irrigation system, which was a system brought over from Spain, but that system actually had come from Northern Africa, which had come from the Mideast. And when it arrived here in New Mexico, it coupled with a very sophisticated system of irrigation that the American Indian communities had been using for millennia. So it's very, very unique, and it ties directly into the significance of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And the image on the right is of a man who is my great-grandfather. His name is Trinidad Romero. I'm descended from Trinidad. His father was Miguel Romero y Paca, and they were basically truck drivers on the Camino Real. They owned wagon trains back in the 1800s. And I point this out because I'm a descendant of people that travel to the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, but there are tens of thousands of others here scattered throughout New Mexico, West Texas, and the rest of the country that are also descendants. And so we have a very much a desire to have these properties recognized for what they're worth. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Destry or Gilbert, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was thorough and interesting and gets the ball rolling in the right direction, I think. So thank you very much. So our next speaker is actually an employee of US ICOMOS, World Heritage USA. Gilbert Correra has been working for the last 3 years, or most of that time, on our Monuments of Oppression project, controversial monuments in the south and southwest and the west coast that have need for a process for how the public considers what to do about that controversy. That's not the subject of today's webinar. We have several that we've done on this topic that are on our website, so check them out if you haven't already. Gilbert has actually moved himself to Mexico City to be closer to this project. He has done international work with ICOMOS, World Heritage in the past. And so he's well positioned to manage this activity for ICOMOS USA. So Gilbert, take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Destry, for the introduction. And Michael, thank you very much for the information. I want to say good morning and good afternoon to all. I'll begin now with a quick overview of our organization, especially for some of our viewership who's probably joining us for the very first time. ICOMOS USA was established in 1965 in Washington District of Columbia, and is a part of this global network of ICOMOS individuals that support World Heritage conservation. For more than 50 years, ICOMOS USA has worked to deliver the best in heritage conservation, historic preservation, the U.S. National Preservation Dialogue, and interpretation to the world of the unique American historic preservation system. And ICOMOS USA is supported by World Heritage USA, its supporting nonprofit. A major element of our mission is to promote and advocate for the addition of appropriate sites in the United States for inscription to the World Heritage List. Interestingly enough, the US was the first signatory to the World Heritage Convention and currently supports 25 World Heritage sites across the United States. All right. So our US-Mexico Binational Nominations Initiative was founded at last year's symposium called Affirming Cultural Identity, World Heritage in the 21st Century. It was held in San Antonio, Texas, and really want to say thank you, made possible to the generous contribution of our sponsors below. At this event, we had a US-Mexico workshop, and we were joined by representatives from Mexico, as Destry mentioned at the introduction, from such as ICOMOS Mexico, the US, the National Committee of Mexico, the National Commission of Natural Protected Areas, or CONAMP, and the National Institute of Anthropology and History, or INAH. We had a rich discussion on collaboration and sponsoring the nomination of several binational sites along the US-Mexico border. And the aim of our initiative is the formal inscription of 4 sites, 2 cultural and 2 natural, along the US-Mexico border. We serve as advisors, subject matter experts, and liaisons to the governments of the United States and Mexico. And around this is really just showing you a brief picture of all the agencies, nonprofits, NGOs that we're going to be working with. And we're really excited about this. So the very first nomination, as Michael so eloquently detailed for us all, is El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And as also Destry mentioned at the introduction, the US refused to support a parallel inscription for the significant portion of this route on the US side in 2009, despite the fact that the US portion of El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro had been designated as a National Historic Trail by Congress and the President in the year 2000. Mexico was successful in getting this historic route inscribed in 2010. And during that period, the Bureau of Land Management opposed World Heritage site inscription because they thought it would violate their duty about various uses. So we think, as Destry also mentioned, that times have changed and the BLM of today would be more encouraging. A World Heritage site inscription similar to the NHT legislative designation only identifies and aims to ensure the protection of particular historic sites along the route, but it does not necessitate a continuous corridor. And for this nomination, this is through various meetings that we've had with our colleagues in Mexico. We plan on inscribing the U.S. route as an extension of Mexico's existing 2010 inscription onto the World Heritage List. The government of the United States must officially request the government of Mexico, the two state parties to the convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage of 1972, to accept the postulation as an extension so that Mexico can formally declare it to the World Heritage Center. And this process is, we were told, the least complicated per consultation with Mr. Alessandro Balsamo, who is the head of nominations at the UNESCO World Heritage Center in Paris. And once accomplished, Mexico can inscribe the remaining sites in Chihuahua to completely inscribe the route in its entirety. That's our goal. The second nomination is El Camino Real de las Californias. El Camino Real de las Californias, briefly mentioned by Mike, is a 594-mile commemorative route that links the 21 Spanish missions, several submissions, 4 presidios, and 3 pueblos. Between 1769 and 1823, the Spanish built 21 missions along the 600 miles of the California coast. Some of these historic locations are still in use as churches today, while others are popular tourist attractions. This significant mission system, which is already well known in California, should be even more widely known by being included onto the World Heritage List. For this nomination, we are in the process of creating a task force that will facilitate communication and collaboration with the Native American tribes tied to the missions. We also plan on eventually creating a binational dossier with our colleagues in INA, Baja California, and Baja California Sur, which in the geography of Mexico, that southern peninsula of California is divided into 2 states. So we will be working with both centers as well as officials. The third nomination is El Pinacate y Gran Desierto de Altar Bioreserve in Sonora, Mexico, with Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge and Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument in Ajo, Arizona. So despite having many common resources, assets, and characteristics across the border, the U.S. declined to nominate a sister site when El Pinacate Reserve was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2013 by Mexico. The U.S.-Mexico Sonoran Desert International Peace Park was first suggested by then Department of the Interior Secretary Stuart Udall in 1965, but no concrete steps were taken. And the area is primarily a wilderness. And for this nomination, we will work closely with CONAMP, who is the body that oversees the site in Mexico. As Mexico is divided into 2, the cultural sites are under the jurisdiction of INA, and the natural sites are under the jurisdiction of CONAMP. And both of them do work together, especially when the site is mixed. And we also will be working with the Magoo Foundation in the UNESCO World Heritage Center. And I also want to highlight and really, as they say, take off my hat to the Magoo Foundation. Our colleague Federico Godinez Leal was the former director of El Pinacate. And ever since he retired, he's actually been working more than when he was director to really conserve the site as much as he can, even using his own funds. So I really want to acknowledge and praise his effort. And the fourth nomination is the Sierra del Carmen Mountains in Coahuila, Mexico, with Big Bend National Park in southwestern Texas. In 2008, Big Bend National Park was added to the U.S. tentative list in anticipation of a potential nomination to the World Heritage List. However, the National Park Service has not yet taken any further action. Similar to this, the Sierra del Carmen Mountains were nominated by CONAMP on multiple occasions in the past, but nothing has come of it. And for this binational nomination, we will create a dossier with our colleagues at CONAMP. And that is it. Thank you so much for your viewership.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. That was was a good catch up for everybody on the extent of the scope of this work, which we're just commencing. It's got a long way to go. I think there will be really 4 separate timelines on this, and we can't foresee what the endpoint might be. We do have a number of questions from the audience, from the participants. They're up in the Q&A. I'll take the first technical one and put that to you, Michael. It says, for the criteria of a cultural route, what constitutes a significant period of time?
Well, it's a very good question, and that's a question that we keep asking ourselves since the charter was ratified in 2008. It is too general for us to really make informed decisions. The idea of a significant period of time, this charter was basically drafted out of Europe. And I think in the eyes of Europe, a significant period of time would be, 200 or 300 years, something like that, or longer. But it brings up the question brings up the issue of, say, for example, Route 66 here in the United States, that went from Chicago to Los Angeles and was active for between 1921 and 1985, I believe. So about 70 decades or 70 years. And in many people's minds, this is long enough to really constitute a long period of time. But of course, if you look at places like Europe, they may have different ideas on that. So the short of it is that we are redrafting, we are revisiting our charter, and hopefully within the next couple of years, we'll have a lot more guidance on what constitutes a significant period of time, among other things. For example, it has to be a relatively long route. Well, what is relatively long? Those are pretty subjective factors. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Michael. We have a number of questions related to sort of what is the process from here and what's its likely outcome and so forth, some of which we can't really predict at this point. Earlier in the program, Michael discussed the U.S. tentative list, and that's a required step for any new potential U.S. nomination. And with that, I would say, late director of the National Park Service, George Hartzog, used to like to say, show me your budget and I'll tell you your policy. Policy without money is just conversation. And that's largely true. The Park Service Office of International Affairs is quite small, has a limited budget from the Congress. Recently had 2 senior members, including the chief of that office, retire. And so it is shorthanded and underfunded. And the budget, how many staff positions they have, how much money they have to provide to contractors, often academics who do research and writing, is limited. So one of the things that US ICOMOS does through our support organization, World Heritage USA, is to provide testimony to the Congress, to the Appropriations Committee on an annual basis to support the programs and functions that relate to World Heritage. And we've done so for the last several fiscal years. Fiscal 25 budget is before the Congress and has to be completed or the government shuts down. The end of the fiscal year is September 30th. In all likelihood, they will not have finished the appropriation bills, the 13 individual appropriation bills by September 30th. That hasn't been done in recent memory, and I've been at this for 52 years. It does often end up in what's called a continuing resolution. It may very well again. Obviously, we've got a presidential election this fall, congressional election as well, for a third of the Senate and all of the House. And so a lot of this is going to come up in the lame duck session, so-called after the election and before the begin of the new Congress and the new administration in January. We'll see what the politics will allow. We've testified in favor of an increase in budget for the Office of International Affairs and for the State Department to pay the back dues that we have not paid in a number of years to the World Heritage Center. Those are issues of money and policy. And I can't predict what the outcome will be at the moment, but we will continue to be advocates for those programs. There's no question about it. One other question that gets to the more practical aspects of this is if this World Heritage Site is designated, how much and what means do the two governments use to collaborate and cooperate? Is there any sharing of resources? I think, Michael, you want to jump in on this if you will, having worked for the Trails Office on these historic trails. I will say that the Park Service has numerous mechanisms to collaborate internationally, and that will, of course, include Mexico. There have been exchanges of professional personnel. There have been technical assistance supports for various things and I would expect if we have a binational designation of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, we will see that opportunity realized down the road. The Park Service's National Trails Office is small and underfunded, and we'll need some support for this if we want to be collaborative and cooperative with the Mexican side of El Camino. It will take some agreement to do that. So, Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, just briefly. In the act that designated the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro as a National Historic Trail, an act that was passed by Congress in the year 2000, in the language of that act, it basically directs the United States to work collaboratively with Mexico, with our Mexican counterparts, to really create a true binational trail, a true binational cultural route. So that's in the actual legislation, and that's something that I think we should keep referring to, is that language already enables us to collaborate extensively with our Mexican counterparts. And Destry, you may be able to answer this better than I am sure you would be, that most recently there's been another memorandum of understanding signed by Mexico and the United States and Canada to collaborate more extensively with issues dealing with natural and cultural resources here in this hemisphere.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. Just last November, the three countries met, actually in Mexico, agreed to update and expand the level of cooperation under that agreement, that trilateral agreement. And that's been one of the most recent things that sort of sets in motion the opportunity to help make this happen. Just week and a half or so ago, the new Secretary of the Environment for Mexico traveled to Washington, met with U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. The Mexican secretary was accompanied by the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Ambassador Ken Salazar, who's the former Secretary of the Interior. And they discussed collaboration and cooperation across the border, conservation initiatives of many sorts. I don't know specifically if they discussed El Camino, though I'm going to try to find out. But the idea is in place for this kind of collaboration and cooperation. And I think we just have to keep people's attention focused on it. There's another question here asking, what do the states think about this, the states that are affected? New Mexico, in particular, the U.S. state, Texas perhaps as well, because of the sites outside of El Paso. We haven't specifically asked the governor of New Mexico this question, but we have had several indications recently that there will be support in the state. Michael, do you want to mention the letter that you've seen from Billy Garrett as one indication of New Mexico's support?
Sure. Billy Garrett is the director of the Palace of the Governors, the Museum of New Mexico here out of Santa Fe. And by the way, he was formerly with the National Park Service. He was a career National Park Service employee who many of us know from that time period. Billy, with the support of his supervisor, who's the cabinet secretary for the state of New Mexico in terms of Department of Cultural Affairs, he enthusiastically supports the idea of pursuing World Heritage designation, not only for the Palace of the Governors, but for the other properties that are being considered here in New Mexico and West Texas. He can't speak for West Texas, but certainly there's 2 or 3 properties in West Texas that could be included as well. So we have good support here at the state level. I've met recently with the cabinet secretary of the Office of Cultural Affairs. She's very enthusiastic about this idea. She was going to be talking it up to the congressional offices as well. Senator Martin Heinrich, Ben Ray Lujan, they've supposedly been made aware of this initiative. And from all accounts, they're going to be supportive of it once it gets to the point of pushing it up the ladder. In West Texas, regarding the sites below El Paso and including El Paso, parts of El Paso, the State Historic Preservation Office, otherwise known as the Texas Historical Commission, has been contacted about this initiative and is very positive about working with us towards getting it accomplished.
Okay, thank you. I have several questions that sort of overlap a bit, wanting to know if the Park Service is on board with this. We have communicated with the Office of International Affairs, and their response is essentially what I said earlier, that they don't at the moment have the staff or the money to pursue this vigorously. Chief of that office is in Delhi at the moment at the World Heritage Center's conference to review this year's set of nominations. The U.S. has put forward the Moravian settlement as a multinational nomination with 3 other nations. That one is on the table and should be approved within the week, if expectations go as it's thought they will. We have 2 other nomination packages under preparation. One is for the Okefenokee Swamp National Wildlife Refuge in Georgia, and the other is for a serial nomination of multiple civil rights movement sites across multiple states. It would be at least 11 sites included in that nomination. We're only allowed, the US government is only allowed 1 nomination per year to the World Heritage List. Those 2 will be presumably the next 2 nominations that are put forward. Um, this one with El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, because it's an extension or an expansion of an existing World Heritage Site, much like the Moravian Settlement nomination is, conceivably and in all likelihood would move through the process a little more easily than the others that are hitting them fresh. I will say that in the case of Big Bend, IUCN at the Park Service's behest sent a technical person to Big Bend in 2000 to look at that nomination. Big Bend National Park is on the U.S. tentative list already and rendered a very positive report. There is no Mexican counterpart yet for the Sierra del Carmen Mountains that are protected in New Mexico but have not been nominated to the World Heritage List for Mexico. So those are issues that will continue to work their way through the process in the years ahead. I'm going to throw this one to you, Michael, as well. Someone asks if the Camino that comes into Arizona from Nogales that was used by Father Kino is being considered for any sort of designation. I'm not aware of it at this point. If you have anything to add to that, would be.
No, I don't. I'm not aware of any initiative either. I do know that the Anza Trail is an officially designated National Historic Trail coming out of Mexico, out of Sonora, up through Arizona, up to San Francisco. He was both the founder of San Francisco in the 1700s. But that particular route, especially since it wasn't used for any great length of time, coming back to that question earlier, probably would not be considered as a cultural route. I can't speak for its significance on the World Heritage, potentially being a World Heritage Site.
Another person from the audience is asking if there are notable differences between the preservation policies between the two countries regarding restoration, rehabilitation, reconstruction, for example. Can you speak to that, Michael?
Sure, these are really great questions. This one included. Over the last 30 years, Mexico and New Mexico and the United States have had a very good program going. It's an informal program, I should say. It's a formal program that carries itself very informally, whereby people, practitioners from Mexico will come up to the United States and critique what we've been doing here in the Southwest with sites, offer suggestions, reintroduce different technologies like lime, working with lime for plasters and mortar, different ways of working with earth and architecture. And reciprocally, we have gone to Mexico and offered our critiques on different aspects of the preservation down there. So there's already, at the ground level, a wonderful group of people that do collaborate and talk very positively about ways to best improve our practices in preservation, conservation of these resources. And we trust that that would continue with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro when these sites in the United States get added to the existing nomination. So there's already some good communication along that front in terms of collaboration, sharing knowledge regarding preservation, conservation.
Very good. Someone else is asking whether we have other countries than Mexico and Canada that we collaborate with. And I will say on behalf of the Office of International Affairs, the answer is yes. They get requests all the time, many that they can't handle for staffing and budget reasons for that kind of collaboration. Over the years, they've done quite a lot. There is a program that's called the Sister Park program, and a number of the World Heritage Sites in the US have a sister World Heritage Site in another country that they collaborate with, that they share staff with, that they do technical exchanges with, that they have visiting delegations from. These have gone on literally for decades. I did 3 trips into the Soviet Union for the Park Service with others, and have done 3 trips into China, looking at Chinese parks and World Heritage Sites. And we just had a ICOMOS China delegation visit us here just a couple of months ago to talk about things that they are doing. So yes, these go on with not a great deal of prior planning because they come up sort of spontaneously quite often. But there is a lot of international collaboration, and the Park Service Office of International Affairs, I think, does as good a job as is possible with their limited budget and staff to keep those relationships moving and alive. I know there was a time in the 60s and 70s when the International Affairs Office was much larger than it is now. It had a much more extensive program than it does now. And maybe one of these days we'll get back to that. And I think with that, unless there's anything to be added, Gilbert or Michael, I'm going to bring the webinar to an end. We're a little bit past our time. So we thank you for participating and joining us today. If any of you have specific questions and want to email me, you may do so, certainly, and I'll respond. Destry Jarvis 2, Destry Jarvis numeral 2 at me.com. We look forward to seeing you the next time we do this. And I think over some time we will cover with a focal point the other 3 of these nominations. And we have done one on the civil rights movement sites and many others, as well as we're working our way through the existing 25 U.S. World Heritage Sites with individually focused webinars. So we'll continue that series as we move forward. Thank you all for participating. Great to see you. I should apologize that Doug Comer, our president, wasn't here today. He is in Peru on business related to Machu Picchu, and the connections was not good. Otherwise, he would have done the intro and the closing. But we appreciate all of you being here. Thank you.